This episode of Legal Eagle was made possible by Skillshare. Learn to think like a lawyer for free for 2 months by clicking on the link in the description. Various corners of the internet have suggested that President Trump is somehow eligible to run for a 3rd term as president.
I'd be for a 3rd term in a heartbeat, yeah.
If we could put him on another 3rd term, we got him.
Pundits have jumped in, and even the president himself has suggested that he might be eligible to get more than 8 years in office.
And then you want to really drive them crazy, go to hashtag 3rd term, hashtag 4th term. You'll drive them totally crazy.
On multiple occasions.
And if things keep going like they're going, we'll go and we'll do what we have to do. We'll do a 3 and a 4 and a 5.
Of course, we all learned in grade school that presidents are limited to 2 terms, but is there a clever way around it through perhaps impeachment or an end run around the vice presidency? Well, I took a deep dive into this just because I was curious and also terrified, so you don't have to. So stick around and let's figure out if there's a way to get more than 8 years in office as president. Hey Legal Eagles, it's time to think like a lawyer because Jerry Falwell Jr. suggested that President Trump should add 2 years to his presidency to make up for the indignity of the Mueller investigation, tweeting, "After the best week ever for real Donald Trump, no obstruction, no collusion, New York Times admits Barack Obama did spy on his campaign and the economy is soaring. I now support reparations. Trump should have 2 years added to his first term as payback for time stolen by this corrupt failed coup." Adding fuel to the fire, President Trump has sometimes speculated on whether he could seek a 3rd term.
Under the normal rules, I'll be out in 2024, so we may have to go for an extra term.
Now, the 22nd Amendment limits a president to 2 terms in office, but other presidents have also mentioned serving a little bit longer. During his 2nd term in 1987, Ronald Reagan said maybe there should be a movement to repeal the 22nd Amendment. And the grandiosity is not limited to Republicans. Barack Obama said that he thought he could be elected a 3rd time if he was eligible to run. And all this poses the question, can a president serve more than 8 years in office? Now, to answer this question, we have to go all the way back to the Revolutionary War. The framers seriously considered making the office of presidency a lifetime appointment, and although they didn't go through with this plan, they were still reluctant to limit the president's time in office. As a result, there were no term limits in the version of the Constitution that was ratified in 1788. The final version of the Constitution ratified by the states made the office of president a 4-year position. The Constitution also created the office of vice president, who would be the president's successor in the event the president could no longer serve. Of course, at the time, the Constitution specified that the person who finished 2nd in the presidential election would win the vice presidency, which was a terrible idea that had horrible repercussions that I'll probably cover in another video. Now, George Washington was the only man ever seriously considered for the first president of the United States. Everyone assumed he would win in a landslide, and he did, twice. And this is probably why many people would have been happy to make Washington president for life, or an elected king. Luckily, Washington was not okay serving as president for life, so when he ran, he privately assured people that he wouldn't even serve a full 4-year term. And he confided in Alexander Hamilton that he thought he would only serve for 2 years and get everything straightened out and then retire early. And though Washington did run for president twice and was elected twice, he decided to retire after the end of his 2nd term. This move set a precedent that lasted 150 years. Washington's retirement established a custom that presidents followed until the 20th century, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected 4 times. This is why customs and laws are different. A custom is defined as a traditional and widely accepted way of behaving or doing something that is specific to a particular society, place, or time. A custom is an accepted norm that cannot be enforced by law. By contrast, laws, as you know, are systems of rules enacted by a governing authority which can enforce them through penalties. And although most presidents followed Washington's custom of quitting after 2 terms, some of them tried for a 3rd term. Ulysses S. Grant ran for a 3rd term in 1880, but lost to James Garfield in the Republican primary. Grover Cleveland wanted a 3rd term, but nobody wanted him. Now, Teddy Roosevelt served as vice president for James McKinley and became president in 1902 after McKinley was assassinated. Now, T-Dog was re-elected in 1904 and served a full 4-year term, but in 1912 he ran for a 3rd non-consecutive term, this time as nominee of the Progressive Party. But he lost to Woodrow Wilson, and Wilson himself sought a 3rd term, but the Democratic Party declined to nominate him. Enter Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt is the only person elected for president for more than 2 terms. He succeeded at getting a 3rd term because he was president during a time of unprecedented crisis for America, both the Great Depression and World War II.
I will, with God's help, continue to serve with the best of my ability and with the fullness of my strength.
And of course, the rest is history. Roosevelt was elected to a fourth term in 1944, shattering the two-term custom. At the same time, in Great Britain, the war also prompted a crisis of leadership. In 1940, Britain amended its Parliament Act, which had permitted a general election every 5 years. Parliament instead opted to extend Winston Churchill's government for 5 more years. Although the war was Roosevelt's primary justification for serving 4 terms, not everyone was okay with this development. Members of Congress had been proposing term limit motions for 140 years. And they continued to do so during Roosevelt's time in office. Roosevelt was in office from 1933 until 1945. Roosevelt died in office just 11 weeks into his 4th term, at which time Vice President Harry Truman became president. In 1947, Congress passed the 22nd Amendment, which limited the president to 2 4-year terms in office. It was finally ratified by the states in 1951. Now, the 22nd Amendment reads, "No person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice, and no person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of president more than once." So the 22nd Amendment says a person can only be elected to be president 2 times for a total of 8 years. A person can serve for a maximum of 10 years in a case of a president who has ascended to the position as vice president. That means it's theoretically possible for a president to serve more than 8 years in office. And a funny thing actually happened while Congress and the states were ratifying the 22nd Amendment, limiting the number of years a person could serve as president. In fact, President Truman tried to win a 3rd term in 1952. The amendment didn't apply to him since he was president when the rule was passed, because the second clause of the 22nd Amendment reads, "But this article shall not apply to any person holding the office of president when this article was proposed by Congress, and shall not prevent any person who may be holding the office of president or acting as president during the term within which this article becomes operative from holding the office of president or acting as president during the remainder of such term." So that gave Truman the green light to run again. But Truman dropped his bid when he lost the New Hampshire primary. But, of course, because you're watching this video right now, this amendment did not settle the debate over term limits, and Truman wasn't the last president to consider a 3rd term. So the question is, what happens if a president dies, resigns, or is impeached? The 22nd Amendment has a provision covering what happens if the vice president is forced to take over. If a vice president takes over because the president dies, is forced to resign, or is impeached, then serves less than 2 years, then the person may serve for 2 terms as president. So for example, if Donald Trump were to die between now and January of 2021, which seems unlikely given that he's the paragon of health, then Mike Pence could take over and run for 2 terms as president, serving out roughly 9 years as president. But if the president dies within 2 years of getting the office, like FDR, who died within 11 weeks of getting his 4th term, then the person who becomes president can only serve out the remaining portion of that president's term and seek re-election once. This would have been the situation for Vice President Gerald Ford, who stepped in after President Nixon resigned in 1973. Ford was only eligible to be re-elected once. He pardoned Richard Nixon and lost the 1976 election to Jimmy Carter. And if you read the text of the 22nd Amendment, it seems to have some open questions. For example, does it only prevent consecutive 4-year terms? Can a person serve 2 terms, return to private life, and then come back for a 3rd? Well, the answer is no. A president cannot run for a 3rd term after skipping a term. The amendment does actually count the years served, not concurrent terms. President Obama, for example, has already served 2 terms and 8 years. He cannot run for 2 more consecutive terms later in his life, or even 1 more term later in his life. Now, some of President Trump's supporters have suggested that since he was impeached by the House but not convicted in the Senate, he's eligible to run for 2 more terms. The reasoning seems to be that impeachment, even without removal from office, nullifies his 1st term in office. So what impact, if any, does the impeachment process have on a person's ability to serve more than 2 terms? Well, the constitutional mechanism for impeachment of a federal officer, including a president, is set forth by Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution, which reads, "The president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors." The House did in fact impeach President Trump. Don't listen to anyone that says President Trump was not impeached. He was. But the Senate did not vote to convict and remove. Now, the Constitution in Article 1, Section 3 says that the political consequences of impeachment, quote, "shall not extend further than to removal of office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States." This means that if a president is impeached and removed, his or her removal is the only political consequence that they face. Now, the person may still face criminal charges, but that's not a political issue. Although President Trump and his supporters have argued that impeachment nullifies an election's results, this is definitely not the case. The only political consequence of impeachment are removal and disqualification, which we'll get to in a minute. Impeachment doesn't operate to somehow give the impeached person more time in office. So President Trump's time in office is not nullified, and he's still bound by the 22nd Amendment. But what would happen if a president was impeached and removed? Could he or she run for a third term then? Well, the text of Article 1, Section 3 seems to imply that impeachment and conviction disqualifies a person from running for a high office later on in their post-impeachment life. Section 3 says that in addition to removal, the only political consequence of conviction is, quote, disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. In 2015, the Congressional Research Service explained that the Senate would need to vote separately on whether a person is disqualified from future office in conjunction with the impeachment trial, stating, although removal from office would appear to flow automatically from conviction on an article of impeachment, a separate vote is necessary should the Senate deem it appropriate to disqualify the individual convicted from holding future federal offices of public trust. Approval of such a measure requires only the support of a simple majority. The report concluded that even if a person is removed from federal office, they may still hold another high office, even president, if voters elect them. The Senate has used this procedure to decide whether other federal office holders, like judges, should be barred from future federal offices. If applied in the presidential context, the Senate could vote by majority to disqualify a convicted president from future office. And there's an additional wrinkle to disqualification. The Constitution isn't clear on which public offices are those of, quote, honor, trust, or profit. You might conclude that offices of senator, representative, or president are such offices, or you can conclude exactly the opposite. This has not been settled or even tested, and the Congressional Research Office is not necessarily the final word. That would be with the Supreme Court, presumably. And maybe this section of the Constitution merely means a person is disqualified for federal offices, but is free to run for state office. But the bottom line is this: if the Senate convicts the president and doesn't hold the crucial follow-up vote on disqualification, that person is free to run for another office. This may include the presidency, but only if the person has not served 2 full terms. Now that's all well and good about the presidency, but maybe the vice presidency is an end run around the 22nd Amendment. So the first question is, do vice presidents even have term limits? And the answer is actually no. Vice presidents are not subjected to term limits. They are treated the same as members of Congress, who also have no limits on how long they can serve. Now, Mike Pence might never become president, but let's say he serves out 8 full years with President Trump, and then, audible shudder, Ivanka Trump becomes president in 2024. Could Mike Pence then serve as her vice president? And the answer is yes. If Mike Pence wants to become a kind of permanent vice president sitter, there's nothing in the Constitution that would prevent this scenario. In fact, this has actually happened twice. George Clinton. No, not that George Clinton and not that Parliament. It was George Clinton who was the vice president for both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Similarly, John C. Calhoun served under both John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. So we know that vice presidents can serve more or less indefinitely, but there's one hypothetical that certain parts of the internet have really glommed onto. There might be one actual way to get around the limitations of the 22nd Amendment, and that involves the office of vice presidency. It might be possible for an ex-president to become vice president and actually get more time in office than they normally would. But the first question is, can an ex-president even serve as vice president? And the answer is yes. This seems like the last thing any ex-president would actually want to do, but a president is not barred from later deciding to be the vice president. No former president has ever volunteered to be vice president, but there's nothing in the Constitution that would stop it. So given that a former president can actually be vice president, one way to potentially get around the 22nd Amendment would be for the president to step down after their second full term, to then serve as someone else's vice president, and then for that president to step down or resign or be impeached or, to just die. At that point, the vice president would then attain the office of presidency. So in that situation, the president turned vice president turned president again wouldn't be elected to the office of president more than twice, but they would be able to serve out more than the mere 8 years. And if you couple that with becoming president after starting out as vice president, that could be 10 years already. You could add almost 4 years on top of that. But hopefully that situation never happens. It's a constitutional ambiguity, and hopefully we won't have to deal with that. But I, for one, don't understand why any president would want to run for a third term, because being president is temporary, but being a YouTube star is forever. Any idiot can be president, but it takes more than being a stable genius to be on YouTube. And if you want to start your own YouTube channel, I'd recommend Sorella Moore's Skillshare class, YouTube Success. Build an authentic channel that's worth the follow. Sorel shares her favorite tips and techniques for building up a devoted online following using examples from her own past content and other creators she loves. And remember, YouTubers are not limited to 2 terms of 4 years each by the 22nd Amendment. Skillshare is an online learning community that has tens of thousands of classes on everything, like design, technology, business, music, you name it. A yearly membership is less than $10 per month, but the first 500 Legal Eagles will get 2 free months of Skillshare when you click on the link below. Plus, it really helps out this channel. Just click on the link. The free premium membership gives you unlimited access to must-know topics so you can improve your skills and learn new things, all free for 2 months. Improve yourself now so you're not limited to just being the President of the United States. So, do you agree with my analysis? Leave your objections in the comments, and check out my other real law reviews over here where I talk about all of the legal issues of the days, like Devin Nunes's lawsuits and presidential impeachment. Just click on this playlist, and I'll see you in court.